October 17th, a day when the earth cracked open beneath a baseball stadium. When an empire's greed plunged the world into crisis. When a beer flood drowned the streets of London. And a gangster finally met his downfall. From revolutions to Nobel Prizes. From earthquakes to genius exiles. This is the day the world refused to stand still. Welcome to Sleeping Historian, where every day tells a story and every story reminds us. The past is never really gone. Before going to start our history of the day, make sure that you have subscribed and pressed the bell icon for future updates. Let's talk about Number 1. The Loma Prieta Earthquake, 1989. The day the ground roared beneath a World Series. October 17, 1989. Candlestick Park, San Francisco. A city alive with the thrill of baseball. The Giants facing the A's in the World Series. Millions of Americans were glued to their screens. It was supposed to be an evening of excitement, triumph, and rivalry. But at 5:04 p.m., something else took the spotlight. The earth decided to move. A deep growl began beneath the Bay Area, a vibration so low, so primal, that for a split second, no one understood what was happening. Then the world shattered. The cameras shook violently. The broadcast cut to black. In that instant, San Francisco was struck by a magnitude 6.9 earthquake, the most devastating to hit Northern California in over 80 years. The city that stopped breathing. In the stands, panic turned to awe, then horror. Concrete cracked beneath people's feet. Highways twisted like paper ribbons. The Bay Bridge, the pride of California, split apart. Entire sections of it fell into the waters below. A man driving home from work suddenly found the road vanish before him. A woman screamed as glass rained from skyscrapers in downtown Oakland. And across the city, the power grid failed, plunging millions into darkness as sirens began to wail in every direction. The quake lasted only 15 seconds. But those 15 seconds changed everything. The world watches in shock. The timing made it unforgettable, because this wasn't just another earthquake. It was broadcast live to the world. As the World Series cameras went black, every channel cut to breaking news. Anchors trembled on air, unsure if their studios would hold. Aerial shots showed collapsed freeways where rescue crews clawed through rubble with bare hands. The Cypress Street Viaduct, a double-decker highway in Oakland, had crumbled completely. Cars were crushed like toys, and the death toll climbed minute by minute. Yet amidst the chaos, something extraordinary happened. Ordinary people became heroes. Commuters and residents rushed into the wreckage, pulling strangers from the mangled concrete. Firefighters formed human chains through smoke and debris. And a community, known for its tech, its art, its spirit, came together in ways no disaster could destroy. The aftermath. In total, 63 lives were lost, and nearly 3,800 were injured. Over 12,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. The economic losses surpassed $6 billion, an astronomical figure at the time. But those numbers only tell part of the story. Because for millions who lived through it, the Loma Prieta earthquake wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a test of endurance of humanity and of memory. The name Loma Prieta means dark hill in Spanish, an eerie foreshadowing of the night that fell on San Francisco that day. From destruction to resilience. In the days that followed, the Bay Area began to rebuild, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Power returned, roads reopened, and baseball resumed. When the World Series continued, fans filled the stands not out of escapism, but defiance. Because the earthquake had revealed something deeper than cracks in the pavement. It had shown the unbreakable foundation of community. That's why, even decades later, people still remember where they were at 5:04 p.m. on October 17th. It's one of those moments where time divides, the before and the after legacy of the quake. The disaster spurred a complete transformation of California's infrastructure. Bridges, buildings, and transit systems were redesigned to withstand future quakes. Seismologists developed new technology for early warnings, inspired by those precious seconds that could have saved lives. But beyond the engineering came a realization that even in a place built on fault lines, the human spirit is harder to break than the ground itself. Soft piano fades in. It's strange to think, what began as a night for America's favorite pastime became one of its most defining modern tragedies. And yet from the rubble rose something timeless, resilience. The city trembled. The lights went out. But the heart of San Francisco never stopped beating. Number 2, OPEC Oil Embargo, 1973. The day the world ran out of gas, October 17, 1973. A date when the world's engines stopped humming. In the early morning hours, representatives of OPEC, the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, gathered in Kuwait City. The meeting began quietly behind closed doors. But by the end of that day, they had made a decision that would send shockwaves around the planet. They announced an oil embargo, cutting off supplies to nations that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War, among them the United States. No one could have predicted how fast the world would unravel. The trigger, war in the desert. To understand the embargo, you have to go back a few weeks earlier, to October 6, 1973. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in Judaism. And at that sacred hour of fasting and prayer, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. Within hours, tanks clashed across the Sinai Desert. Fighter jets streaked across the Golan Heights. And once again, the Middle East became the burning center of global tension. The United States, led by President Richard Nixon, quickly sent military supplies to Israel. That move infuriated the Arab oil-producing nations, who saw it as direct interference. So OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, decided to strike not with weapons, but with oil, the black gold weapon. At the time, oil wasn't just fuel. It was civilization's lifeblood. Every car, every plane, every factory, all of it ran on petroleum. And the United States, despite being a global superpower, was deeply dependent on Middle Eastern oil. So when OPEC imposed its embargo and simultaneously slashed production by 5% per month, the results were immediate. Gas stations across America ran dry. Long lines of cars, stretching for miles, became the new normal. Drivers waited for hours, sometimes sleeping in their vehicles, praying there'd still be fuel when their turn came, the day the pumps went silent. In small towns, no gas signs replaced prices. In big cities, tempers flared. People fought at the pumps. A gallon of gas that once cost 38 cents doubled, then tripled, in a matter of weeks. News anchors spoke in hushed tones. Politicians scrambled for answers. And in homes across America, people began turning down thermostats, canceling trips, and carpooling just to get to work. It wasn't just an energy crisis, it was a psychological one. For the first time, Americans realized something they'd never had to confront before. The world could stop, and there was nothing they could do about it. The shockwave around the world. The embargo didn't just affect the US, it crippled Europe. It hit Japan. It reshaped the balance of power across the globe. Factories slowed. Inflation soared. Entire economies teetered. Suddenly, oil, once considered abundant and cheap, became a weapon of diplomacy. The Western world's dependence had been exposed, and the nations that held the oil, countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates, realized just how much leverage they had. In one stroke, they had turned the tables of global power. The silent streets. Winter of 1973 felt colder than most. Streetlights dimmed to save energy. The speed limit across the United States was lowered to 55 mph to conserve fuel. Airlines cut routes, and people began hoarding, not just gas, but food and essentials, fearing another collapse. In Detroit, car manufacturers were forced to rethink everything. The age of gas-guzzling giants, those chrome-plated symbols of American pride, was over. Small, fuel-efficient cars from Japan started taking over the market. It was the beginning of a transformation in how the world thought about energy, consumption and control, oil, politics, and power. Behind the scenes, diplomacy worked overtime. U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger shuttled between Middle Eastern capitals, negotiating quietly. Each conversation, each handshake, was a balancing act between pride, power, and desperation. Finally, after 5 months, in March 1974, the embargo was lifted. But by then, the world had changed forever. Prices never returned to what they were. The age of cheap energy was gone, and OPEC had proven that economic might could rival even military power, the echo that never faded. The 1973 oil crisis planted seeds that would grow for decades. Nations began searching for alternatives: nuclear power, solar, wind. Fuel efficiency became a matter of national security. And for ordinary people, it changed something even deeper: trust. The illusion of endless abundance was shattered. The 20th century's dream of infinite growth had met its first real limit, and in its place came a quiet question. Write in the comment, what happens when the fuel runs out? Again, the OPEC embargo wasn't just about oil. It was about leverage. About nations long overlooked suddenly holding the world hostage with the twist of a valve. It showed that the age of colonial control was over, and the age of economic dominance had begun. In that way, October 17, 1973, wasn't the day the world ran out of gas. It was the day the world realized who really held the keys to its engines. Section 3. Al Capone Convicted, 1931. The fall of America's most infamous gangster. October 17, 1931. In a Chicago courtroom, a man who had once ruled an empire of crime sat behind a polished oak table, his pinstriped suit sharp, his fedora resting beside him. His name was Alphonse Gabriel Capone. To the world, he was Al Capone, Scarface, the king of Chicago, the face of American organized crime. But that day, for the first time in years, Capone wasn't giving orders, he was taking them. From a judge, from a jury, from the law he'd spent a decade mocking, the making of a myth. Al Capone didn't start as a villain. He started as a kid, born in Brooklyn, 1899, to Italian immigrants. He was bright, street-smart, and restless. By the age of 14, he dropped out of school after striking a teacher who hit him. He drifted through New York's underworld, working for small-time gangs, learning the code of the streets. That's where he earned his nickname. A young bouncer. In a bar, Capone insulted a woman, and her brother slashed his cheek with a knife. The scar became permanent. So did the name. In 1919, he moved to Chicago, a city about to become his kingdom. Prohibition, the gold rush of crime. When the U.S. government banned alcohol in 1920, intending to purify the nation's morals, it created something else entirely, the greatest criminal opportunity in history. Illegal breweries, secret speakeasies, underground smuggling networks, all were waiting to be claimed. Capone joined Johnny Torrio's operation, a smooth businessman of the underworld. And when Torrio was nearly killed in a rival attack, Capone took over. By 1925, Al Capone controlled Chicago's bootlegging empire, worth over $100 million a year. He bribed police. He paid off judges. He even dined with politicians. To the poor, he was a hero, a man who handed out food and blankets during the Depression. To the press, he was a legend, the smiling gangster who ruled with charm and violence in equal measure. But behind that grin lay a shadow, the city of blood. Chicago in the late 1920s wasn't just a city, it was a battlefield. Capone's men fought rival gangs for territory. The North Side Gang, led by George Bugs Moran. Assassinations, bombings, shootouts, they became part of daily life. And then came Valentine's Day, 1929. A cold morning in a garage on North Clark Street. 7 men, Moran's associates, lined up against a wall. 4 men in police uniforms entered, brandishing Tommy guns. Moments later, gunfire echoed through the city. The St. Valentine's Day massacre became front-page news worldwide. Though Capone was never directly linked, everyone knew. It bore his signature. The myth of Scarface turned into terror, the public enemy. Capone's empire looked invincible. He controlled the streets, the police, and even the politicians. But one thing he couldn't control was the taxman. The federal government couldn't pin murder or bootlegging on him. Witnesses disappeared, evidence evaporated. But a young agent named Elliot Ness and a relentless accountant named Frank Wilson saw another way. If they couldn't get Capone for blood, they'd get him for numbers. The charge? Tax evasion. It sounded ridiculous. The most feared man in America brought down not by bullets, but by bookkeeping. Yet that's exactly what happened. The trial. The trial began in October 1931. Crowds gathered outside Chicago's federal courthouse every day. Reporters, photographers, even school children hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had become part of American folklore. Capone arrived each morning in a tailored suit, smiling for the cameras, waving like a movie star. He was confident, too confident. He had bribed the jury, his men boasted. The verdict, he thought, was guaranteed. But on the morning of October 17th, the judge pulled a move no one expected. He quietly switched the entire jury with another from a different courtroom. Capone's grin faded. After days of testimony, accountants showing ledgers, agents describing hidden money trails, the verdict came in. Guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. Sentence: 11 years in federal prison, the longest ever for tax crimes at the time. For the first time, America's untouchable gangster was touched by justice. The prisoner. Capone was sent first to Atlanta, then later to the one place even legends feared, Alcatraz. The Rock, the island fortress off San Francisco Bay. Here, there were no reporters, no bribes, no influence, just steel, sea air, and silence. The once dapper kingpin now spent his days scrubbing floors, his mind deteriorating from untreated syphilis. By the time he was released in 1939, Al Capone was a shadow of himself. His power gone, his empire dissolved, his health broken. He returned to Florida, where he lived quietly until his death in 1947, the legend that wouldn't die. Yet even in ruin, his legend only grew. Movies, books, songs. The myth of Al Capone became a reflection of America's dark fascination with power, greed, and rebellion. He was part villain, part folk hero, a reminder of an age when money ruled morality and the law seemed optional until it wasn't. As historians later wrote, Capone didn't just define the gangster era, he ended it. The irony of justice. The great irony of Al Capone's story is that he built an empire through intimidation and blood, but it was undone by ink and paper. His fall taught America something profound, that even in a world of corruption, the system, slow, flawed, and stubborn, could still work, because in the end, the man who ruled through fear fell to a ledger. On October 17, 1931, the King of Chicago learned what every empire learns eventually. Power fades. Money runs out, but history never forgets. Section 4. Albert Einstein arrives in America, 1933. The genius who escaped the storm. October 17, 1933. A ship glides through the mist toward the New York harbor. Among its passengers is a man with wild white hair, a pipe in his hand, and eyes that seem to carry both sadness and wisdom. His name is Albert Einstein, and on this day he arrives in America. Not as a tourist, not as a celebrity, but as a refugee, fleeing the shadows spreading across Europe. The man who unlocked the secrets of the universe was now escaping one of humanity's darkest storms. A mind beyond Earth, Einstein's story begins decades earlier, in Ulm, Germany, 1879. He wasn't a child prodigy, at least not in the way stories like to claim. He spoke slowly, daydreamed often, and his teachers thought him lazy. But inside his quiet mind, something extraordinary was forming. By his mid-20s, while working as a patent clerk in Switzerland, he began to reimagine the universe itself. In 1905, a year historians now call his Annus Mirabilis, or Miracle Year, he published 4 papers that changed science forever. One of them introduced a small equation you might have heard of, E MC2. It wasn't just mathematics, it was a key, unlocking the hidden link between energy and matter, between stars and atoms. Einstein became a symbol of intellect itself, a living portrait of human genius. But even the brightest light casts shadows. The world changes. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the world grew darker. Germany, still recovering from World War I, fell into economic despair. And in that despair, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power. Einstein, Jewish by birth and international by spirit, became one of their most hated figures. Nazi propaganda labeled him a fraud, a threat to German science. Books bearing his name were burned in public squares. Professors who admired him were dismissed. And death threats began to arrive. Einstein was in California when Hitler became chancellor in January 1933. He knew immediately he couldn't go home, a genius in exile. In March of that year, Einstein quietly renounced his German citizenship. He returned his passport to the German consulate in Brussels, saying, "I shall live in a country where political freedom, tolerance, and equality of all citizens reign." For a man who had devoted his life to understanding the laws of nature, it was humanity's laws, twisted by hate, that drove him into exile. By October, his destination was clear: the United States of America. He was offered a permanent position at the newly founded Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, a haven for thinkers, far from the storms of Europe. When his ship, the SS Westmoreland, docked in New York on October 17, 1933, reporters crowded the pier, shouting questions. Einstein smiled politely and said, "I am happy to be here. I do not wish to live in a country where people are forbidden to think." Behind that gentle smile was a man who had lost his homeland, but not his hope. A new beginning in Princeton. Princeton was a quiet town, far removed from the chaos consuming Europe. Here, Einstein found what he called a small, modest existence. He spent his mornings walking to the Institute, his afternoons deep in thought, and his evenings playing violin for friends. But though his life looked peaceful, his mind remained restless. He was haunted by what was happening across the ocean: the persecution of Jews, the destruction of universities, the rise of totalitarianism. Einstein began using his fame not for science, but for activism. He became a vocal advocate for refugees, for peace, for civil rights. He helped Jewish scientists escape Nazi Germany, often sponsoring them personally. To those who expected the aloof genius, they met instead a man of conscience, humble, humorous, and unafraid to speak truth to power, the scientist and the atom. But, even far from Europe, Einstein couldn't escape the consequences of his own discoveries. His equation, E, where mc2, which once seemed purely theoretical, had become the foundation of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. In 1939, with war now raging in Europe, a letter drafted by Einstein and physicist Leo Szilard warned President Franklin D. Roosevelt that Germany might develop an atomic bomb. That letter would help launch the Manhattan Project, a decision that haunted Einstein for the rest of his life. Though he never worked directly on the bomb, he carried the weight of its possibility like a burden. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he confessed, "If only I had known, I would have become a watchmaker," the symbol of genius. As years passed, Einstein became more than a physicist. He became a symbol, the face of human intellect. His messy hair, his calm demeanor, his refusal to conform, they made him instantly recognizable around the world. Children sent him letters asking for help with homework. Reporters waited outside his home in Princeton for quotes about anything: science, religion, even politics. When asked about fame, he once said with a smile, "It is not that I am so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer." And yet, behind the gentle humor lay profound sadness. He missed his homeland, his friends, his colleagues who never escaped. He carried the scars of exile quietly, in the way he spoke softly, and in how he avoided discussing the past. Legacy of a wanderer. Albert Einstein lived the rest of his life in Princeton. He never returned to Germany. When offered the presidency of Israel in 1952, he declined, saying he lacked the natural aptitude and experience for such a role. In his later years, he focused on what he called the unified field theory, his dream of linking all the forces of nature under a single law. He never completed it. When he died in 1955 at the age of 76, his final words were spoken in German. Words lost forever because the nurse at his bedside didn't understand the language. But his ideas, they continue to shape everything, from nuclear energy to GPS satellites to our very understanding of space and time. The refugee who redefined the world. Einstein's arrival in America was more than a personal escape. It was a turning point in global history. His presence helped make the United States a center of scientific progress. His advocacy for peace and civil rights inspired movements long after his death, and his journey, from refugee to icon, remains a reminder of something timeless. That even in the darkest moments, the pursuit of knowledge and compassion can outshine fear and hatred. On October 17, 1933, a man stepped off a ship into a new world. He left behind the madness of tyranny, carrying nothing but his mind and his ideals. And in doing so, Albert Einstein didn't just find a new home. He helped humanity find a new horizon. Section 5. Completion of the Burma Railway, 1943. The Death Railway, October 17, 1943. Deep in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the final railway spike is driven into the track. It's a simple sound, the strike of iron on steel. But behind it lies one of the most horrifying human stories of World War II. This is the tale of the Burma Railway, also known by a name whispered through history with dread and reverence. The Death Railway, a bridge between empires. The year was 1942. The Empire of Japan had swept across Asia, occupying vast territories from China to Singapore. But Japan's supply lines were stretched thin, especially between Bangkok in Thailand and Rangoon in Burma, now Myanmar. To maintain control and push their war front westward, the Japanese army decided on an ambitious and brutal plan: to build a 415-kilometer railway through some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. They called it essential to the war effort. History would call it a monument to human suffering. The laborers. Over 60,000 Allied prisoners of war, mostly British, Australian, Dutch, and American, were captured after Japan's rapid conquests. To these men, the railway became their nightmare. But they weren't alone. An estimated 180,000 Asian civilians from Thailand, Burma, Malaya, and beyond were also forced into labor. They worked side by side, under the tropical sun and relentless rain, cutting through mountains, hacking through dense jungle, and laying rails through swamps that swallowed men whole. The prisoners were given little food, no medicine, and less mercy. They slept on bamboo mats in disease-ridden huts. Malaria, cholera, dysentery, the jungle claimed them faster than bullets. In the end, over 100,000 people died, one life for every 3 meters of track laid. The Hellfire Pass. Among the railway's most infamous stretches was a cutting known as Hellfire Pass, named by the survivors for its nightmarish glow. At night, torches and fires lit the rock walls as skeletal men swung hammers and picks, their shadows flickering like ghosts. Japanese guards shouted orders. The sound of metal on stone echoed through the valley like a cry of despair. One Australian prisoner later wrote, "It looked like a scene from Dante's Inferno. Men, bones, and flame. They were made to work, 18 hours a day, starving, feverish, often barefoot, until they collapsed. If a man slowed down, he was beaten. If he stopped, he was killed. The railway demanded not just labor, but life itself. The jungle's toll. Imagine the world these men endured. Monsoon rains turned the ground into mud. Mosquitoes swarmed like clouds. Snakes and leeches were constant. The stench of sickness hung heavy in the humid air. But the worst torment wasn't the jungle. It was hopelessness. Many POWs didn't even know where they were. Their letters never reached home. Days blended into weeks and weeks into the endless rhythm of hammer strikes and screams. Yet somehow, amid all this, fragments of humanity survived, acts of quiet bravery. Even in hell, men found ways to remain human. Prisoners risked death to steal medicine from Japanese stores to treat their sick. Doctors improvised surgeries with rusty razors and bamboo splints. They made artificial limbs from scrap wood and tin. In the darkness, they whispered jokes, shared scraps of food, and even carved small musical instruments to play faint songs of home. There are stories, small, nearly forgotten ones, of guards turning away during punishment, of a few who smuggled extra rice, of compassion flickering even in cruelty. And sometimes, those moments of mercy were all that kept a man alive. The railway completed. By October 17, 1943, the line was complete. from Banpong in Thailand to Thonbusayat in Burma. It had taken 16 months, an impossible pace, achieved only through forced labor and unimaginable suffering. The Japanese held a ceremony to celebrate the achievement. Flags were raised, speeches were made, but the prisoners, thin, fevered, hollow-eyed, looked on in silence. For them, it wasn't triumph. It was survival. And even that came with guilt, because so many had not made it. The railway would operate for barely 2 years before Allied bombings and Japan's surrender rendered it useless. But by then, it had already claimed its toll in human lives. After the war. When the war ended in 1945, the horror of the Burma Railway came fully to light. War crimes trials were held. Japanese officers responsible for atrocities were executed or imprisoned. But justice, if it came at all, could never balance the scale. Many survivors returned home broken, their bodies scarred, their minds haunted. They spoke of nights where the jungle seemed to whisper the names of the dead. Some never spoke at all. In the decades that followed, the railway itself became overgrown, swallowed again by the jungle it defied. But its story lived on in memoirs, in photographs, and in the faint tracks that remain to this day, a symbol of endurance. Today, the Hellfire Pass Memorial in Thailand stands as a reminder, not only of the cruelty of war, but of the endurance of the human spirit. Visitors walk through the cutting, where sunlight now falls peacefully on the same rock once soaked in sweat and blood. They hear recorded voices of survivors, their words trembling with emotion. One voice says softly, "We lost everything, but we kept our humanity, and that's how we survived." The railway was meant to connect two nations. Instead, it connected generations, a living thread that reminds us of the cost of ambition and the power of compassion. The final spike. On that October day in 1943, as the final spike was driven into the track, one Japanese engineer reportedly said, "Now we have conquered the jungle." But history would write a different ending. They hadn't conquered it, they had fed it. And the jungle never forgets. Today, as trees reclaim the rusting rails, as vines curl around the bridges, and as the spirits of those lost rest beneath the soil, one truth remains. No railway, no empire, no ambition is worth the price of 100,000 souls. The Death Railway was born from war, but it endures as a lesson for peace. Section 6. The first British Open Men's Golf Championship, 1860. The birth of a sporting legacy. October 17, 1860. Prestwick Golf Club, Scotland. 11 men stand on the dew-covered grass, their coats buttoned against the cold sea breeze. Before them lies not just a golf course, but the beginning of a tradition that will outlast empires. They're about to play in the very first British Open Championship, the event that would define modern golf and crown the first champion of the sport. But no one here knows that. They only know the smell of salt air, the weight of their wooden clubs, and the simple joy of the game, a game born on the wind. To understand what happened that day, we must go back, centuries before trophies and sponsorships, to the rugged Scottish coastlines where golf began. Golf wasn't invented by kings or companies. It was born in the wild, among shepherds who passed the time by hitting stones with crooked sticks across dunes and heather. The earliest records of golf stretch back to the 15th century, when King James II of Scotland banned it, because soldiers were playing too much golf and neglecting archery practice. But the game couldn't be banned. It was part of Scotland's soul, a mix of patience, precision, and defiance. By the 1800s, golf had spread beyond the shepherds. It had become a gentleman's game, played by the wealthy, debated in clubhouses, and celebrated across the British Isles. And yet, by 1860, something was missing. A true champion, someone recognized not just in one club, but across all of golf. The death that sparked a tournament. Ironically, the British Open was born not from celebration, but from loss. In 1859, Alan Robertson, considered the greatest golfer in the world, passed away. He was known as the first professional golfer, a man whose skill was unmatched, whose name drew respect across Scotland's links. When he died, the question arose, who now is the best golfer in the world? Prestwick Golf Club decided to find out. They announced an open competition, a single day, 3 rounds of 12 holes each, open to the best players in Britain. The prize? Not money, not glory, but a red Moroccan leather belt, decorated with silver. They called it the Challenge Belt. The day of the first Open. October 17th, 1860. The morning mist hung low over Prestwick. 11 golfers arrived, all men, all professionals. No amateurs were allowed that first year. They carried their own clubs, dressed in waistcoats and heavy boots, and prepared for what seemed to be an ordinary day of play. But as the first ball was struck and rolled across the rough, history began to move quietly forward. There were no crowds, no cameras, no grandstands, just players, caddies, and the whisper of wind across the dunes. Each man would play the 12-hole course 3 times in one day, 36 holes total. It was grueling, demanding, and pure, and by the end of it, one name would echo beyond Scotland: Willie Park Sr. Willie Park Sr., the first champion. Willie Park wasn't from privilege or wealth. He was a self-made player from Musselburgh, confident, brash, and immensely talented. His rival, Tom Morris Sr., known as Old Tom Morris, was the opposite. Quiet, methodical, and deeply respected, their rivalry defined early golf. Park's aggressive play versus Morris's precision, passion versus discipline. When the final hole was completed, Park's total was 174 strokes, 2 better than Morris. He lifted the red leather belt high, not realizing he had just etched his name into sporting immortality. It was the first British Open, and from that moment, golf would never be the same again. A game of gentlemen becomes a game for the world. The tournament returned every year after that, first at Prestwick, then rotating between the great Scottish courses of St. Andrews and Musselburgh. By 1861, amateurs were allowed to compete. By the 1870s, crowds began to gather, and by the early 1900s, the Open had become international, attracting players from across the Atlantic. The red leather belt would later be replaced with something new, a silver trophy that gleamed in the Scottish sun. The claret jug. Today, it remains one of the most coveted prizes in sport, the spirit of the links. But the real soul of the Open isn't in the prize, it's in the place. Scotland's links courses are unlike anywhere else. The wind shifts every hour. The grass isn't manicured, it's alive. Bunkers aren't just obstacles. They're scars carved by centuries of weather and war. Every swing, every bounce is a conversation with the land. When players like Tiger Woods, Jack Nicklaus, and Tom Watson walked these same fairways more than a century later, they weren't just chasing victory. They were walking in the footsteps of ghosts, men who played for nothing but pride and the love of the game. Old Tom and the legacy. Old Tom Morris, who finished second in that first Open, would go on to win 4 championships himself. He became the guardian of golf, a man who shaped the rules, designed courses, and raised a son, young Tom Morris, who would become an even greater champion. Together, the Morrises defined what it meant to play with honor. They believed golf wasn't about perfection, it was about patience. It wasn't about winning, it was about enduring. Their legacy, like the game itself, endured long after their final swings, from 11 players to millions. From those 11 men on a misty Scottish morning grew a sport that now reaches every corner of the world. What began as a few holes in the dunes became an Olympic event, a global phenomenon, a game of kings, presidents, and everyday dreamers. Golf courses now sprawl across deserts, mountains, and cities. But the heart of it all still beats on that first green at Prestwick. Every time someone tees up, whether on the old course or a humble patch of grass, they're part of that same lineage. A quiet echo of 1860, a gentle game in a turbulent world. In a century filled with war, revolution, and industrial noise, the Open stood for something else. Stillness. A reminder that history isn't only written in battles and bloodshed. Sometimes it's written in silence, in the pause before a swing, in the sound of a golf ball soaring into the wind. That's why this event, born 165 years ago, still captivates millions today. It isn't just about the score. It's about grace under pressure, honor in defeat, and mastery over the self. When Willie Park struck that final putt on October 17, 1860, he couldn't have imagined where his victory would lead. From quiet dunes to global stadiums, from wooden clubs to titanium drivers, golf has evolved, but its spirit remains the same. The game that began on the Scottish coast that day still asks the same question it did then. Not how far you can hit, but how true you can be. So comment that how many of you are from golf family? Or share this history with those who are golf players, love the game, or have won any golf championship. Number 7. London Beer Flood, 1814. The day London drowned in ale. October 17, 1814. London's St. Giles district, a crowded, poor working-class neighborhood known for its narrow alleys and the smell of brewing hops. It was a quiet Monday afternoon at the Moo and Company Brewery on Tottenham Court Road. Inside the massive brick building stood giant vats of dark, frothy porter, enough beer to fill rivers, and then something gave way. A single iron hoop snapped. A sound like a gunshot echoed through the brewery. Then came another crack, louder, deeper, and the world turned to chaos. The flood begins. At 5:30 p.m., one of the brewery's enormous fermentation vats burst open. It was 22 feet tall and held over 135,000 gallons of beer. That's more than 500,000 liters. The pressure from the collapse tore open the neighboring vats, one after another, in a chain reaction of destruction. Within seconds, nearly 323,000 gallons of beer surged through the brewery walls and into the streets. The explosion was so violent that it shattered bricks, collapsed walls, and sent wooden beams flying like matchsticks. Eyewitnesses described the sound as a thunderclap, a roaring wave of liquid darkness tearing through the neighborhood. A sea of porter. The flood raced into the streets of St. Giles, one of London's poorest areas. The torrent was 8 feet high in places, sweeping away everything in its path. Carts, fences, even parts of homes. People screamed as beer poured into basements and homes. Children playing outside vanished beneath the wave. In the crowded tenements, families barely had time to react. One eyewitness, George Crick, the brewery's storehouse clerk, later said, "The noise was dreadful. I was thrown to the floor by the rush of air and beer. And for a moment I thought the world was ending." The smell of porter filled the air, thick, yeasty, suffocating. Within minutes, the floodwaters turned streets into rivers, sweeping through New Street, George Street, and even reaching Holborn, the human toll. The disaster was both surreal and tragic. In a city already burdened by poverty, the flood claimed lives not by fire or violence, but by beer. 8 people died that evening. Most were women and children who drowned or were crushed when buildings collapsed. At 22 New Street, a wake was being held for a 2-year-old boy when the flood hit. The mourners were swept away instantly, a heartbreaking twist of fate. In another home, a mother and daughter were trapped beneath fallen debris after the force of the flood destroyed their walls. The victims' names, Mary Mulvey, Hannah Banfield, Sarah Bates, faded into history's footnotes, but their story lives on as one of the strangest tragedies London ever faced. Beer and desperation. When the wave finally settled, the streets were filled with knee-deep pools of dark porter. The smell hung in the air for days. Curious Londoners flocked to St. Giles, bringing jugs and buckets, hoping to collect free beer. But what they didn't realize was that the water, mixed with sewage and debris, was toxic. Dozens fell ill afterward. Some newspapers described the scene with grim humor, calling it a flood most agreeable to the taste, if not to the lungs. But for the families who had lost everything, there was nothing to laugh about. In the days that followed, the brewery was investigated. Many expected Moo and Company to be charged with negligence. After all, how could such a catastrophe happen in the heart of London? But the verdict shocked everyone. The flood was ruled an act of God. The courts decided that no one was to blame, that the iron hoops had simply failed. No compensation was required. The brewery, however, suffered massive financial losses and nearly went bankrupt. To recover, they petitioned Parliament for a tax rebate on the lost beer, and astonishingly, they got it. Meanwhile, the victims' families received nothing but sympathy, a city that laughed to forget. In true London fashion, dark humor soon crept in. Ballads were written about the river of beer. Cartoonists sketched drunken men rowing through the streets with mugs in hand. But beneath the jokes lay something deeper, a sense of irony about Life in industrial Britain, a nation that had conquered the seas, could still be undone by a broken barrel. The London beer flood wasn't just a bizarre event. It was a reflection of a time when industry grew faster than safety, and profit mattered more than protection. It revealed the cracks in a society where the rich owned the breweries, and the poor lived in their shadow. From tragedy to legend, as the years passed, the flood faded into myth, a story whispered in pubs, half believed, half forgotten. But historians later rediscovered the truth. It wasn't an urban legend. It really happened, and records still exist in the London archives. To this day, the Moo Brewery site, now part of central London, carries no monument, no plaque, no reminder of that strange day. But the story lingers in the folklore of the city, alongside tales of the Great Fire, Jack the Ripper, and the Blitz, the human spirit beneath the foam. Yet, amid the tragedy, there were glimpses of resilience. Neighbors risked their lives to pull survivors from collapsing homes. Local pubs offered shelter and food to those who'd lost everything. The city mourned, then rebuilt as it always did. For London, the beer flood became another chapter in its long relationship with disaster and endurance. Floods, fires, plagues. The city always rose again, stronger, wiser, a little more human. And perhaps that's why this strange event endures, because even in absurdity, it showed who Londoners really were: tough, compassionate, and irrepressibly alive. The echo in time. More than 2 centuries later, the London beer flood feels like something from fiction, too bizarre to be real. But maybe that's what makes it unforgettable. It's a story of how fragile life can be, how progress unchecked can turn dangerous, and how tragedy often hides behind the ordinary. That day, beer, the symbol of joy, celebration, and community, became a force of destruction. And yet, it left behind something strangely poetic, a reminder that history isn't just written in wars and empires, but also in the small, absurd, and human moments that define who we are. October 17th, 1814, the day London drowned not in sorrow or sin, but in beer, a day that began in laughter and ended in silence. History remembers it not for its heroes or villains, but for its sheer, tragic irony. The flood that began in a brewery ended in the hearts of those who never asked for a toast. Number 8, Battle of Saratoga, 1777, the turning point of the American Revolution. October 17th, 1777, a date that reshaped the destiny of a young, fragile nation and changed the course of world history. The American Revolution had raged for 2 long years. The British Empire, confident in its military might, believed the rebellion would soon crumble. But in the dense woods of upstate New York, on a crisp autumn morning, that belief began to die. This is the story of the Battle of Saratoga, the moment when revolution found its roar, a plan for domination. That summer, the British had a plan, brilliant on paper, catastrophic in reality. General John Burgoyne, a confident aristocratic officer, had been sent from Canada with 7,000 troops. His mission? March south, capture Albany, and sever New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies. From the west, Colonel Barry St. Ledger would advance through the Mohawk Valley. From the south, General Howe would move north from New York City. 3 armies converging like a closing fist, crushing the American resistance once and for all. But plans have a way of unraveling, especially when arrogance leads the way. The American stand. The American forces, led by Major General Horatio Gates, numbered around 9,000, a mix of Continental soldiers, militiamen, and volunteers hardened by desperation. Among them was a fiery, reckless officer named Benedict Arnold, before his name became synonymous with betrayal. Back then he was a hero, fierce, daring, impossible to control. The Americans built fortifications along the Hudson River near Saratoga. They waited, patient but tense, knowing the Redcoats were coming. When Burgoyne's army appeared in September, the fields of upstate New York turned crimson, not from autumn leaves, but from blood. Freeman's Farm, the first clash. On September 19th, the first major battle erupted at Freeman's Farm. The forest echoed with musket fire. Cannon smoke rolled through the trees like fog. Lines of red and blue uniforms clashed in brutal confusion. The Americans fought like men, defending not just their land, but their very right to exist. Arnold's division struck Burgoyne's flank repeatedly, refusing to yield. Though the British held the ground by nightfall, their victory was hollow. They had lost nearly twice as many men as the Americans. The message was clear: this revolution would not go quietly. The long wait and the second storm. Burgoyne, stubborn and proud, refused to retreat. He waited weeks for reinforcements from General Howe. Reinforcements that would never come. His army grew weaker, his supply lines thinner. Men starved, horses died, and morale crumbled. By October, the British camp was on the brink of collapse. Yet Burgoyne pressed on, a gambler with nothing left to lose. Then on October 7, 1777, he struck again and sealed his fate. Bemis Heights, the decisive blow. At Bemis Heights, the Americans were ready. Cannon thunder rolled across the ridges. Benedict Arnold, furious after being sidelined by Gates, charged into battle on his own, rallying the troops with a reckless courage that bordered on madness. He led wave after wave of assaults, personally riding through the smoke and fire, shouting commands as bullets tore through the air. His leg was shattered by a musket ball, but he refused to fall back. As soldiers dragged him from the field, the British lines began to crumble. By nightfall, Burgoyne's army was shattered, trapped, surrounded, and hopeless, the surrender. 10 days later, on October 17th, Burgoyne accepted the inevitable. Under a pale autumn sky, he met General Gates in a tent pitched on the quiet fields near Saratoga. With dignity and a heavy heart, Burgoyne handed over his sword. More than 5,800 British soldiers laid down their arms that day. The once invincible empire had suffered its first major defeat in the war. The Americans had done the impossible. They had beaten the British army in open battle. The world takes notice. The shockwaves of Saratoga traveled across the Atlantic. In London, Parliament fell silent, disbelief turning into dread. But in Paris, the news was met with smiles. France, long nursing its own grudge against Britain, saw opportunity in this rebel victory. It was Saratoga that convinced King Louis XVII to officially recognize the United States and sign an alliance treaty. French ships, money, and soldiers soon joined the fight. The war was no longer a colonial rebellion. It had become a global struggle for freedom and empire, the paradox of heroes. In the aftermath, Horatio Gates basked in glory, hailed as the hero of Saratoga. His name filled newspapers, his image painted into legend, but for Benedict Arnold there was only bitterness. His bravery had turned the tide, yet his superiors refused to acknowledge him. The wound he suffered at Saratoga never healed, neither in flesh nor pride. Years later, it would fester into betrayal, as Arnold defected to the British cause. It is one of history's cruelest ironies. The man who helped win America's greatest victory would later become its most infamous traitor, the turning point. But in 1777, none of that was known. What mattered was that the tide had turned. Saratoga proved that courage could outmatch power, and conviction could defy empire. It transformed the American Revolution from a desperate gamble into a cause worth believing in. When the smoke cleared, the world saw a new possibility, that ordinary people, united by a dream, could stand against kings, the echo that endures. Today, the quiet fields of Saratoga are peaceful, rolling hills, tall grass, and whispering winds. But beneath the soil lie echoes of musket fire, cannon shot, and the cries of men who fought for the idea of liberty. Visitors walk among the monuments, unaware that here, on this very ground, the future of a nation was born. Because on October 17, 1777, in the golden light of a dying autumn, a small army of farmers, blacksmiths, and dreamers proved something timeless. That freedom is never given. It is fought for, and sometimes it begins in a place no one expects. Saratoga wasn't just a victory. It was a message to the world, a whisper that became a roar, and a reminder that from the humblest beginnings can rise the greatest revolutions. Number 9. Mother Teresa wins the Nobel Peace Prize, 1979, The Saint of the Slums, October 17, 1979. A small woman in a simple white sari steps into a grand hall in Oslo, Norway. The world watches. Cameras flash. But she does not smile for the attention. She is uncomfortable in it. When her name is called, Mother Teresa, she bows her head humbly, accepting the Nobel Peace Prize. Not for herself, but as she says softly, in the name of the hungry, the naked, the homeless, the crippled, the blind, of all those who feel unwanted, unloved, uncared for. That day, the world stood still for a moment, not for power, not for politics, but for compassion, the woman behind the name. Her real name was Angeze Gongshe Bojakshiu, born in Skopje, then part of the Ottoman Empire in 1910. From a young age, she felt drawn to a life of faith and service. At 18, she left her home forever and joined the Sisters of Loreto in Ireland, soon traveling to India, a country that would become her destiny. In Calcutta, now Kolkata, she began teaching at a convent school. But beyond the walls of the classroom, the streets told another story, one of poverty, sickness, and despair. Children begging for food, families sleeping under broken roofs, the forgotten dying in silence. It was there, amidst the chaos, that she heard what she called the call within the call. A voice, quiet, insistent, urging her to leave the comfort of her convent and serve the poorest of the poor. And she obeyed. The streets of Calcutta. In 1948, dressed in a white sari with blue borders, the colors of simplicity and purity, she stepped into the slums of Calcutta with nothing but faith. She had no money, no plan, and no promise of success. But she had purpose. She began teaching children to read using sticks and dirt as chalk and slate. She tended to the sick, washed their wounds, and sat beside the dying, not to save them, but to ensure they did not die alone. People began to notice. One by one, others joined her, young women inspired by her selflessness. Together, they formed the Missionaries of Charity, dedicated to serving, as she said, the unwanted, the unloved, the uncared for. The world notices. For years, she worked quietly, unknown to the world, but the light of compassion has a way of breaking through even the darkest corners. By the 1960s and 70s, photographers and journalists began telling her story. The image of a frail woman cradling the sick and dying on the streets of Calcutta captured global hearts. To some, she was an angel. To others, a mystery. How could someone dedicate their entire life to those society had forgotten? The Nobel moment. So when the Nobel Committee announced in 1979 that the Peace Prize would go to Mother Teresa, many felt it was long overdue. In her acceptance speech, she did not talk about politics or grand theories of peace. She spoke about love. We are not social workers. We are contemplatives in the heart of the world. If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. Her words struck like lightning. Simple, yet devastatingly true. She refused the ceremonial banquet and asked that the $192,000 prize money be given to the poor of India. With that sum, she fed thousands, faith and controversy. But even saints walk in the shadow of doubt. As her fame grew, so did scrutiny. Critics accused her of accepting donations from controversial figures and offering what they called poverty without cure. Some questioned her medical facilities, others her stance on contraception and abortion. Yet, through it all, Mother Teresa never defended herself with anger. She only said, "If you judge people, you have no time to love them." To her, faith wasn't about perfection, it was about service. She believed that to help one person at a time was enough. The power of one. She continued her work for decades, in India, Africa, Latin America, and beyond. By the time of her Nobel recognition, the Missionaries of Charity had over 400 missions in 120 countries. They ran orphanages, homes for the dying, centers for lepers, and schools for the poor. And wherever she went, she carried the same message: do small things with great love. The last years. In her later years, illness weakened her body but not her spirit. She suffered from heart problems and exhaustion but refused to rest. When asked how she found the strength to continue, she smiled gently and said, "I am a little pencil in the hand of God." In 1997, at the age of 87, she passed away in Calcutta, the city she had given her life to. Her funeral drew millions. Hindu, Muslim, Christian, it didn't matter. They all came to say goodbye to the woman who had reminded them of their shared humanity. In 2016, she was canonized by the Catholic Church as Saint Teresa of Calcutta. But for most, she had been a saint long before the title was official. Legacy of Light today. Her legacy lives in the countless lives she touched, not through grand miracles, but through acts of quiet mercy. Her nuns still walk the streets in white saris with blue borders. They still hold the dying, feed the hungry, and teach the forgotten. In a world that often feels divided and loud, her whisper remains powerful. Peace begins with a smile, and in that smile, however small, however fleeting, the world can still find hope. October 17, 1979 wasn't the day a woman became famous. It was the day the world remembered what compassion truly means, because peace is not a treaty. It's not silence between wars. It's one heart choosing kindness when it's hardest to give. And Mother Teresa gave it every single day. Number 10. Birth of Eminem, 1972. The Rise of a Rebel Poet. October 17, 1972. In St. Joseph, Missouri, a baby is born to a young single mother named Debbie Nelson. No one in that small hospital room knew that this child, Marshall, Bruce Mathers III, would one day become one of the most influential voices in modern music. He would grow up to call himself Eminem, a name that would echo through every alley, every car stereo, every angry teenager's headphones across the world. But before he was a global icon, he was just another kid from the wrong side of Detroit, broke, bullied, and invisible. This is the story of how pain became poetry, the hardest beginning. Marshall's childhood was anything but stable. His father left when he was a baby. His mother moved constantly, from one small apartment to another, chasing jobs, chasing rent, chasing survival. He lived mostly in Detroit, one of America's toughest cities in the 1980s, divided by race, poverty, and frustration. In school, he was the quiet kid, thin, pale, often beaten up for no reason. But he found something that gave him power: words. Rhyme, rhythm, storytelling. He discovered hip-hop, not as a listener but as a survivor. He once said, "I started rhyming just to prove I existed," and that's exactly what he did, finding his voice. By his teenage years, he was sneaking into Detroit's underground rap battles, smoky rooms filled with MCs trading verses like punches. A white kid in a black art form, he was an outsider among outsiders. But when he stepped up to the mic, everything changed. He wasn't the outcast anymore. He was unstoppable. His rhymes were sharp, fast, and brutally honest, cutting through beats with surgical precision. Detroit rappers started noticing the kid they called Slim. He didn't rap about cars, money, or fame. He rapped about pain, poverty, and the chaos in his own mind. Slim Shady, the alter ego. But something else was brewing inside him, an alter ego. A darker, rawer version of himself that could say everything he couldn't as Marshall Mathers. That voice became Slim Shady, loud, angry, unfiltered. A character born from trauma, poverty, and the need to scream back at the world that ignored him. When he dropped the Slim Shady EP in 1997, it wasn't just music. It was a manifesto, a cry of rebellion wrapped in rhyme. And that's when fate stepped in. The Dr. Dre connection. In Los Angeles, legendary producer Dr. Dre heard a demo tape of this underground rapper from Detroit. Within seconds, Dre said, "Find him, now." When the two finally met, something clicked. Two worlds, two generations of hip-hop colliding. Their first session. They recorded "My Name Is." The song exploded across MTV and radio. Eminem, the skinny white kid from Detroit, had arrived. But fame didn't bring peace. It brought exposure, and with it, controversy. The shockwave Eminem's lyrics were violent, outrageous, and brutally honest. He rapped about everything, from his broken family to his hatred of fame, from poverty to politics. To some, he was a poet. To others, a menace. Parents protested. Politicians attacked him. But the kids, they listened, because in his rage, they heard their own. Eminem was giving voice to a generation that felt lost, unseen, and misunderstood. He didn't pretend to be perfect. He just told the truth, even when it was ugly. The Mathers legacy. In 2000, his album The Marshall Mathers LP became one of the fastest-selling albums in history. Songs like Stan, The Way I Am, and The Real Slim Shady turned him into a cultural phenomenon. But behind the fame was a man still fighting demons, addiction, depression, and the weight of his own words. He often said music was his therapy, his way of surviving a world that had tried to break him. In Cleaning Out My Closet, he confronted his mother. In Mockingbird, he poured his heart out to his daughter, Haley. Every verse was a confession, every rhyme a wound laid bare. Redemption through rhythm. Then came the fall. The fame, the pressure, and the pills, they nearly killed him. By 2007, Eminem overdosed and almost died. But in typical Mathers fashion, he didn't fade out quietly. He came back stronger, sober, clear, and focused. His album Recovery in 2010 wasn't just a comeback, it was a resurrection. With songs like Not Afraid and Love the Way You Lie, he proved that vulnerability could be powerful. He had gone from street battles to world stages, and still, the fire in his words burned the same. The poet of pain. Eminem's genius lies not just in rhyme, but in reflection. He turned trauma into art, transforming anger into empathy, violence into vulnerability. He once said, "You'd be surprised how much can come out of silence when you listen to pain." To his fans, he wasn't just a rapper. He was a mirror, reflecting the chaos, confusion, and courage of growing up in a broken world. The legacy of 8 Mile. The 2002 film 8 Mile, inspired by his own life, cemented his legend. It told the story of a young rapper, poor and desperate, battling not just others but his own fears. When the movie's anthem Lose Yourself hit the airwaves, it became more than a song. It became a mindset. You only get one shot. Do not miss your chance to blow. This opportunity comes once in a lifetime. It was the voice of ambition, resilience, and raw human hunger. That song won an Oscar, making Eminem the first rapper ever to win the award. Still standing. Today, decades later, Eminem stands as one of the best-selling artists in history. Over 220 million records sold. Countless awards. And yet he still lives in Detroit, quietly, still writing, still battling. Only this time, with himself. Because for Eminem, the mic was never about fame. It was survival. October 17th, 1972, the day a rebel poet was born. He didn't just change music. He gave pain a rhythm. He made millions of people believe that their story, no matter how dark, could be rewritten in rhyme. In a world that loves silence, Eminem taught us that speaking truth, even when it shakes walls, can save your life. The echo of October 17th, and that was the story of October 17th, a single date woven through centuries of triumph, tragedy, genius, and rebellion. From the ground shaking beneath California's skyline, to Einstein stepping onto American soil, to a young poet in Detroit finding his voice. Each moment reminds us that history isn't written by time, it's written by people. People who dared, people who dreamed, people who changed everything. If this journey moved you, don't let it end here. Hit like, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and subscribe to Sleeping Historian, where every sunrise reveals another forgotten story from our shared past. And if you haven't yet, go back and watch October 16th, the day revolutions rose, queens fell, and nations trembled. Then join me tomorrow for October 18th, where new secrets of time await. This is Sleeping Historian, where history never sleeps. It just waits to be awakened.